When the founding fathers were considering what to include in the Constitution, a document that was meant to unite the colonies, they landed at the wisdom of the Iroquois people and their document, the Great Law of Peace. The Iroquois was really a confederacy of 5 tribes all across the northeast of our country: the Mohawk, the people of the Flint, the Oneida people of the Standing Stone, the Onondaga people of the Hill, the Cayuga, the people of the Great Swamp, or the people of the Great Boat, they would say, and the Seneca, the people of the Great Hill. These 5 tribes, and a little bit later on, a 6th, they would share trading rights and a civic life and a common governing council, a common language. But mostly, and far more importantly, they were bound together in agreement of peace and cooperation. That great law of peace was agreed on and signed by the leaders of each of these great nations way back in 1142. By the time our founding fathers came around, this document of liberty and government uniting colonies of people, so to speak, had been standing for hundreds of years. And if you were to put those 2 documents side by side, the Constitution and the Great Law of Peace, in both you would see outlined a process for how to make a law. You would see guidelines for distinct branches of government. You would see systems of checks and balances, a statement on who can declare war and when, guidelines on who could be elected into leadership, how to remove someone from office. They practically share the same chapter in our high school civics books. In 1744, the Onondaga leader, I'm going to try to say his name, Kanasatego, the contentious 13 colonies to unite. The then English columnist, Benjamin Franklin, was so taken by this speech that he printed it and he circulated it, so he knew it well. Kanasatego talked about unity, and he used this metaphor about how many arrows together cannot be broken as easily as the one arrow. And that's why, to this day, on the Great Seal of the United States, there is an eagle clutching a bundle of arrows, 13 of them. Because we are better, stronger, more formidable together. But ironically, in drafting our Constitution, our founders left out one of the most essential principles of that great law of peace. That was the 7th generation principle. Who here has heard of that? Anyone that was here for Wednesday night soup supper, we talked about it quite a bit. You've heard of it. And it's ironic, I say, because the 7th generation principle is kind of at the heart of that great law of peace. It's taught by many Native American nations, not just the Iroquois, and it says that every decision, be it personal or governmental or corporate, that we must consider how it will affect our descendants 7 generations into the future. Every decision made today should lead towards sustainability. Western society, we kind of think of a generation as about 25 years. The Lakota Nation says that a generation is 100 years. Either way, consequences for our decisions need to be considered a long time into the future. At our Wednesday soup supper this past week, we talked about this, that 7th generation principle. And I asked the table group, what are you doing individually, as a family? What are we doing as a nation, internationally, to be mindful of the 7th generation? And it was more than a little evident on Wednesday night, and perhaps it is still today, that we live in a time of deep uncertainty, especially about the health and the sustainability of our own Mother Earth. Our conversation quickly jumped to real fears about having to colonize Mars, perhaps sooner than that 7th generation mark. A legitimate fear, as NASA and private space industry folk are already navigating that possibility. Perhaps we share that fear. And when you think about it and you consider that the Great Pacific Garbage Patch is a real thing, an area the size of Texas, somewhere between Hawaii and California, where all the plastic waste on the planet kind of gathers together, it's a Texas-sized state of plastic bottles and straws and stir sticks and microbeads from our face wash, grocery bags, industry waste like fishing nets and sneakers. Back in 1990, a shipping container accident dumped 31,000 Nike shoes into the ocean, and ocean pollution researchers are still regularly finding whole, intact Nike sneakers floating around in that garbage patch. How many generations will it take for that plastic to be broken down, to be collected? If we ignore it entirely, how long will it take for the ocean to not be able to survive that anymore? And that's just little things like straws and bottles and shoes. Little things that many of us use and dispose of without a second thought. How many generations will it be for us to overcome our litter? Little things. And what about the big things? Chernobyl, that incident in Russia that spewed radioactive material that happened all the way back in the 1980s. Researchers estimate that it'll take 10,000 generations for that land to be inhabitable again. 250,000 years before that land will be able to sustain human life. Isn't that amazing? All these things stem from our own apathetic consumerism and faulty corporate practices and a kind of a live-in-the-moment trade policies. I don't know if any of you have seen that Disney movie WALL-E, but it's looking more and more prophetic. The problem of waste is so big that it's hard to wrap our mind around. And while we are worried about whether or not there will be an earth for our generation in 7 generations, Abram, in our reading from Genesis today, is wondering if there will be a nation for the earth. And not in 7 generations, but he's worried about it in 2. Abram, soon to be renamed Abraham, and his wife Sarai, soon to be renamed Sarah, they're introduced to us in Genesis 11, a little bit before this. Just following the creation narratives and the flood, and this is a time of great rebuilding for the earth as a whole. It's a time when everything is going forth and multiplying like it should. And yet, it's unsurprising to me that the first people that the Bible really zooms in and focuses in on, since the old story of Adam and Eve, is an aging, childless couple. Go figure that God would be totally smitten with these people, this unlikely couple, and would decide to bring about a holy nation from them, a nation that would be a blessing to the world. God loved picking underdogs every time. Joseph sold into slavery, he rose to be a king, right? David, a scrawny tween, defeated Goliath. Mary, that teenage mom, carried the Son of God. So, in typical divine fashion, the Lord chose the most unlikely couple, an aging, childless couple, to be the ancestors of a blessed nation. The Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to a land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse those who curse you. And in you and all your families you shall be blessed. And so Abram and Sarai, they went. They journeyed to that land, and they waited for their child, a child who would become the first of their many descendants, the child that would turn their name into a great nation, blessed to be a blessing, God said. Time passed. They went to Egypt. They came back. No child. They became prosperous, even wealthy. No child. They prayed and they waited. No child. Their nephew Lot, separated from them. Lot was captured. Lot was rescued, if you remember that. And still no child. They prayed and they waited. No child. And then finally, the Lord broke his silence on this. And that's how our reading starts today. After these things, meaning after a long, long time, the Lord spoke to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, God said. Whenever we hear those words throughout God's story, we know that there is good news to follow. Do not be afraid. I haven't forgotten about you. I am your shield and your very great reward. Meaning that Abram can trust God to come through on that promise, to make his family numerous and a blessing to the world. God sort of doubles down on his promise in that moment. And yet, how does Abram respond? I think Abram responds like any frustrated man, knowing the years and the lengths that he and his wife have gone through to conceive a child, and yet for months and months been reminded that now is not the time. Abram pushes back at God. He cries out with a voice of lament. Rather than praising God for this renewed promise, Abraham cries out in pain regarding the deep hurt and the unfulfilled hope of his life. He and Sarai are childless, and he brings that to God's feet. Abram is so honest in this scene. His pain and his grief is almost guttural. He shares his fears and his hurts, his frustration over the fact that all he has worked for and built up, which is a great wealth, will not be left to a family that he was building it for, but to a slave in his household. What does this tell us about God? I wonder. I don't think that God ever expects us to be meek and mild, to be compliant and quiet in our pain, in our frustrations. I don't think that God expects us to be peaceful and patient and without doubt. Sometimes God's timing feels cruel, and I think God knows that. As we explored last week, hunger is a classroom, right? Our deep, soul-wrenching worries and lacks, there is something there in those places, something there for us to learn. Abram and Sarai may be among the first to wait on God, but they are far from the last. And how does God respond? Look up at the stars, Abram. Count them if you can. Take it all in. Your family will be like this, I promise. And to that, Abram trusted. Did that trust come from a place of choice, having to choose it? From a place of faith? Did it come from a place of lament? We will never know. But from wherever it came from, God saw it as honest and righteous. And then something incredible happens. Not a child. They have to continue to wait for that. But God asked Abram to make a sacrifice, a big one. A heifer, a goat, a ram, a dove, a pigeon, the whole petting zoo, pretty much. Abram is to take it and to cut them all in two, graphic, I know, and he separates the parts. Because God is about to cut a covenant, a karat barit, to cut a covenant. And in the ancient world, when two parties were going to enter into an agreement with each other to make a promise, they would make a sacrifice, take an animal, cut it into two, separate the parts, and together those two parties, they would walk through the sacrifice together, hand in hand at times. They would make a promise this way, so graphic, to be a statement of, if I was to break this promise, so might I be like this sacrifice. And if you'll remember from our reading, it is not Abram that is to enter into this promise. This is a promise that God makes to Abram. Abram is put into a deep sleep. And that fire that is present in the scene, it is the fire that moves through the sacrifice. It is God that makes that covenant, that promise. It's amazing. God expects nothing of Abraham in return, not yet. God just needed a little bit more time, maybe. God just needed a little bit more biology. God needed a little bit of faith, a window of opportunity, who knows, but this covenant is God's to keep, and God's alone to keep. This moment kind of fizzles with the beginning of grace. There is perhaps just a little bit of that spark of unconditional, unearned, unmerited, uncomplicated love of God that we know of through Christ. It fizzles with that grace of God, love unbound. Abram trusted. That trust came from a place of grief, but God saw it nevertheless and called it righteous. Walter Brueggemann wrote this week, "The future of God's goodness is open to those who trust in the future, neither holding on to the present or conjuring an alternative future of their own. Faith is reliance on God's promise that will overcome the present with a new life." Children of God, I ask you to consider that within the light of the 7 generations principle. Are we considering the nature of the church 7 generations from now? Both the Big C, Church Universal, and our own little boat here. There are real concerns throughout the Protestant church about what we will look like 7 generations from now, even 2 generations from now. And those concerns are deep, and they are valid, and they are mighty concerns, worthy of our attention, our discussion, our exploration. And at times it is worthy of our lament. Let us open our grief towards God, just as Abram did. Let us let God into our worry, because this worry comes from a righteous place. Our church is a family of conscience and connection, a body of mission, a place of creativity and expression. And this physical meeting house is a gathering place for the community, and it could be even more so. And these are things that will exist as long as people exist, be it here or on Mars. The church of God is vital and it is valid. When we think about our world, our house of prayer, our legacy 7 generations from now, let's let God in on our hope and our fear. Abram did. And to his lament, God doubled down and tripled down on his promise to bring about a holy, vast nation, one that would be a lasting blessing to the world. while the waiting is never simple. For we are hungry. God is always faithful. Always. As Brueggemann said, the future of God's goodness is open to those who trust in the future, neither holding on to the present nor conjuring an alternative future of their own. Faith is reliant on God's promise of overcoming the present for a new life. May we be blessed and deeply convicted this week about that 7 generations principle. I pray that we are able to let God in on our places of worry, of our places of fear, and that we might be soothed by the assurance of God's goodness and God's presence. God is good?
All the time.
All the time?
God is good.
God is good.
All the time.
All the time.